Everybody. My name is Richard Salt, and I'll be your host for today in this digital resilience webinar discussing unmasking hidden risks, a deep dive into third party, but more commonly known as supply chain intelligence. On my panel, I have a CTO, Andrew Brown, and a CISO, Nilesh Bhachain. And we'll be going through and having a chat around supply chain risk. So firstly, Andrew, how would you define effective third-party risk intelligence slash supply chain risk in today's business environment and why it's increasingly important?
So the way I would define it is looking at your complete supply chain and understanding how your supply chain can compromise your organization. There is a lot of emphasis that has been placed on phishing, on vulnerabilities, but supply chain compromise is a very little understood way that it actually organizations get compromised. It is increasingly a way that your threat actor is actually compromising your organization or gaining initial access. And there is some very good information on the US CISA, that's CISA website with regard to Boeing and their compromise, which they ended up from Citrix. So some very good, well-known names here as to how that actually took place.
So what you're saying is that there was a vulnerability in the Citrix software and the threat detection mechanisms that Boeing had never picked it up, but then a third-party risk intelligence would come and pick that up, right?
Absolutely. If you were aware of your supply chain and you were monitoring and looking at your supply chain, then you should have become aware of that. Also, should you be using SaaS solutions and sharing data with various SaaS providers? It may be you want to warn your SaaS provider or ask your SaaS provider questions, and be alerted to the fact that they could be using something like Citrix. And it's a case of, well, Mr. SaaS provider, we can see you using Citrix, or another one was MoveIt, which was one of those file sharing type applications. Have you patched it? Are you aware of the vulnerability? What do you intend to do about it? So this is about being complete aware of your whole supply chain and how it could compromise your business.
Okay. Thank you, Nilesh. What are the primary challenges organizations face in implementing an effective supply chain risk management program?
Thanks, Richard. So, I mean, there's various challenges, right? I mean, if you think about it, the first one, and this is one of the most common, is lack of visibility. Organizations often have limited insight into their third-party ecosystems, making it hard to assess and monitor risks. Another one is regulatory complexity. I mean, the complexity world, the compliance world is so diverse today across the various jurisdictions. I mean, ranging from country to country. These can start becoming daunting after a while, especially for global operations. Resource constraints, I mean, managing risks effectively requires significant investment in personnel, tools, and training, which many organizations struggle to allocate, and the rapidly evolving threats. I mean, cyber risk, data breaches, geological and geopolitical factors are continually evolving faster than our security mechanisms can evolve. So, it's outpacing static risk management frameworks.
So you would say supply chain risk is a kind of a sprawl because we can become more and more connected into our vendors and suppliers, and we have certain restraints on resources, whatever, skill sets.
100%. Let's be honest. I mean, organizations don't have personnel and resources to dedicate to third-party risk management 24/7.
Cool. Andrew, can you bring out your crystal ball? And how do we see supply chain risk management evolving in the next year to 18 months? How do you see this evolving in our world?
So there's two sides to that. Your threat actor is really onto something here. They have realized that they have found an ideal blind spot in a lot of organizations. So compromise one, compromise many. And it's quite an effective way for them to do this. On the other side, what I see happening is it's probably one of the most misunderstood areas of cyber that I've come across, and how people are going about using legacy practices to try and get their head around this exercise. And I keep hearing terms like, we need to report risk to the board, okay? And while I understand them wanting to do that, it's a little hard to report a 0 day to the board before it's actually happened. So, you now need to look at, how do you get a handle on this? Where are you likely to see this risk coming from? So what I see happening is there's, again, when I talk about legacy practice, if we look at what organizations are doing, they are going and spending thousands and thousands and thousands evaluating different vendors that they work with, and it doesn't scale. It's too expensive. It's not yielding results. So what needs to happen in the next, 18 months to 3 years type thing is automation, a greater understanding. What is it you're looking for? What do I really actually need to do that is going to let me know where this risk happens to be? How do I monitor for this risk? How do I become aware of it? And in which case, the question I like asking organizations is, okay, if I tell you, I'm going to give you 2 weeks notice that your SaaS vendor who does your payroll is going to, or likely to have, or suffer a ransomware attack, what are you going to do about it? And there's a lot of silence there, and it's a very difficult question. So, it's those type of answers that both the organization assessing their vendor and the actual SaaS provider need to start being able to answer.
Right, that leads me into the next question with you, Andrew. What initial steps should organizations take when establishing a third-party supply chain risk management program? I mean, where do you begin? How do you start this journey?
So what I've been saying to customers is, and literally, it's like having this little bit tattooed on your forehead, but go and stick a post-it note on the top right-hand side of your screen. And the question you need to keep answering over and over again whenever you're doing this is supply chain compromise. How can this vendor or actually cause compromise to my organization? So if we look at it, I see organizations going along and saying, oh, we've classified this vendor as critical or high, okay? And I'm like, great, that's nice. Okay, what does that tell you? It doesn't really tell you much at all. I'm not saying don't do that, by all means do that, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. So what happens if, from an availability perspective, is that an issue? Okay, so let's take your SaaS vendor doing your payroll. If that vendor is not available, okay, no one's going to get paid. Availability is a big issue. What happens if that vendor gets compromised? Well, if you shared all of this data with them, okay, that's now a data breach. So that's an issue. But you need to take it further from the perspective of work your way through various scenarios. So let's take someone like DigiCert. DigiCert's a certificate provider. So if DigiCert's not available, well, probably not a train smash when I'm trying to buy a new certificate. If I've done it in advance, hopefully they'll be back up in a week's time, and I still got time to renew my certificate. So probably not an availability train smash. What happens if they're compromised? What type of compromise can take place? Well, what happens is they could end up with an issue with one of their root certificates, in which case I need to be notified about it. How am I going to receive that notification? How am I going to become aware of that? Because while the certificates might actually be valid on my website, someone's actually got the key so they can translate. So if we move on and we say, okay, let's take something like Okta. Okta, huge issue if it's not available. Okay, no one can log into anything. Compromise, bigger issue. Did they end up with everybody's username and passwords to everything that's floating around? Okay, so you can see the challenge in here and looking at being able to ask these questions. I've sort of drawn up a list of 4 areas to be able to add to your classification, literally to simplify it. So what my suggestion is, how do we start? Start simply. So are they providing a product to you? So take Citrix. There's no point in evaluating Citrix, the company, when you're using Citrix, the product. Evaluating Citrix, the company, tells you very little about Citrix, the product. Are they a SaaS vendor? Okay, so Salesforce, Workday, HubSpot, MailChimp, they're all SaaS vendors that you make use of. Service, okay, companies like, Capgemini, Deloitte, PwC, there's loads of service companies out there. So how do you actually look at that and evaluate that? If they've provided a whole pile of people that sit on your site, okay, is there any point in actually doing any sort of evaluation of them as a vendor? Back to the question, how will they compromise my environment? And then I've chunked in other, okay? Other is important because you now need to start looking at your greater supply chain and having visibility of your greater supply chain. So let's take an example that probably a lot of organizations can relate to. CrowdStrike. We might not use CrowdStrike. Do we know how many of our vendors use or third parties use CrowdStrike? Probably not, okay? And so when the CrowdStrike issue hits, how is that going to impact our business? Are there any other sort of vendors like that lurking? How am I going to become aware of this? If I do become aware of it, how am I going to understand the impact it might be having on my supply chain? So this is a series of questions that need to be asked. You can't ask them all at once. Start simple, okay? A simple, easy program is, an effective program, and it will develop and mature over time.
Thank you. Nilesh, talking about resources and that, how do you balance the need for thorough vendor assessment with the demand for operational efficiency? And you've alluded to some of the challenges early on. Maybe you just want to expand on that.
Sure. So, I mean, the balance of vendor assessments with operational efficiency demand is quite a fine line. So, again, it's alluding to some of what Andrew has mentioned. It's adopting a risk-based approach. So focus on vendors where you assess their criticality or their severity levels rather. Determine what access they have. So do they have access to critical systems? Do they have access to sensitive data? Utilize this knowledge, this information to prioritize them for detailed assessments. Leverage automation. So, I mean, the use of AI and tools for security questionnaires, risk scoring platforms, these AI-powered assessments, they exist today. So we need to make use of them and reduce the manual effort, coming back to the resource constraints we mentioned earlier. Standard processes and frameworks, implementing processes and frameworks like NIST or ISO to create consistent, repeatable assessment workflows, saves time and effort. But in the same breath, we need to be quite clear. A NIST and ISO is a framework. It's not a principle. It's not a policy that we live by. So all of these frameworks needs to be brought into an environment. It needs to be assessed to ensure that it fits the environment and adopt it to the way your business functions. That's why that balance bringing back to operational efficiency is important, because it's adopting it to provide operational efficiency, right? And another point is collaborating with stakeholders. So engage the likes of your procurements, your legal, your IT teams to align vendor assessments with business objectives to avoid redundant efforts. It's not an isolated approach. So the more you involve different people, different thoughts, different um, business units, it starts aligning closer and closer to what the business wants to achieve and what the objectives are.
There's breaking down those silos in the business, which is so traditional there, where IT, business, HR, finance all operate independently, and it's
Yeah.
actually cutting across that. Can you share a real life example of a third party supply chain risk incident you managed and what lessons you learned?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, some third-party supply chain risk incidents I've managed was a project I was once busy on. A vendor was storing customer data, experienced a phishing attack that compromised sensitive information. The breach revealed gaps into email security and data encryption protocols. So some of the lessons learned was, establish mandatory security standards with all these third parties, which at the time we didn't have. Regularly, sorry, rather, conduct phishing simulations and training for vendor employees. So, I mean, it's not something that, as an organization, we would personally do, but rather more so, ensure that this is getting done within those organizations, get the results from it, get the output of it, understand that output, understand where there could be possible gaps in the environment, understand what their breach simulation frequencies are and how they deal with breaches, to ensure that we are always safe as an organization. The other was then include breach response clauses in contracts to perform reporting audits, routine audits to ensure compliance with security requirements. So, I mean, this is something that's greatly and vastly overlooked when contracts are being done. And that's the one thing we have to start considering is that, if no matter what the vendor is doing for the organization at the time, should the vendor ever be breached, it comes back to, what is the impact? Is it a confidentiality breach? Could it be an availability breach? What is the business, the business response capabilities? What is their continuity mechanisms? And how do we as an organization get affected by this? And then ensuring that there's clauses, there's standards, there's the right legal requirements put into those contracts to ensure that we safeguard ourselves.
Okay, so how do you prioritize vendors for risk assessments when resources are limited? Risk assessment, supply chain risk, same thing. But I mean, how do you prioritize when your resources are limited?
Look, I think it comes back to that criticality assessment, right? And what their severity is. So if a vendor is regarded as a critical severity, we have to have a very distinct framework in place as to what is it that we need to assess as part of that vendor. What is the controls that we require as an organization to work with this vendor? So if it's an availability issue, what is their BCM mechanisms that's put into place? What is our BCM mechanisms that's put into place? Do we have a physical failover? Do we have redundancy somewhere else if it's a fire in that organization or in that building? Do we have a personality constraint? There's various mechanisms around this, and it really boils down to what is your disaster recovery? What is your BCM? Do you even have this in place? I think it's an area that's vastly overlooked. People don't relate the two very quickly. Incident response to disaster recovery, back to business continuity, and the sooner we realize that these three aspects are very much intertwined, the sooner we can get closer to how we need to start managing this.
Cool. Andrew, kind of left you out there a little bit. What tools or technologies do you consider essential for third-party supply chain risk intelligence? So here we're looking at tools. What are the things that I would need as an organization?
Yeah, so Richard, the tools that and technologies I consider essential is have a look back over the past 2 to 3 years. There's some good resources on how supply chain compromises taken place. So once you've figured out what is actually happening, it then helps you to answer the tools that you actually need for the job. So it's like assessing what is the job, okay? Very much like any DIY. There's no point in coming to the job with the wrong set of screwdrivers or spanners when you need sockets. So I'd be looking at, first of all, using a cyber risk ratings tool, okay, that provides you with open source intelligence. Open source intelligence, there's a lot of people don't understand open source intelligence, what it gives to you. A lot of people are very surprised about open source intelligence and what is actually out there about their organizations. This is how your threat actor finds the compromise in a large number of cases. They're not after you as a company. They sit there, and if I go back to the Citrix example, it was very simple. They went onto Shodan, they typed in the word Citrix, and it provided them with a list of organizations that had a Citrix and the corresponding IP address. They then sat there and put their initial access team on it, okay, and they worked their way through it to find out, you know, which ones were actually exploitable. And when they found one, they passed it on to the next team to gain initial access to an organization. So, you know, when would you have been compromised, depending on where you were on the list, which is sort of, you know, anybody's guess. So how was that found? That was found by open source intelligence. So what you need to realize is no amount of due diligence, no amount of questionnaires, no amount of monitoring, okay, would have necessarily turned that up in advance. You could have assessed that or seen that risk by looking and identifying Citrix and saying they have had these issues in the past. How are we going to make sure that if this happens in the future, we are going to be notified about it and we are going to be addressing it? Which then brings me on to part two is, okay, so I receive a notification. So what happens is I'm told that I have this in my organization. So do I make sure, how do I make sure that the relevant teams, okay, are doing it? I need to make sure it gets to my SOC, or I have, if I've got a smaller team, some type of after hours alerting, something like Slack. Or if I've integrated into my ticketing system, if I've got a ticketing system, which we should do, then I can notify via my ticketing system. I can also use my ticketing system then, once I've received this notification, to look at the other vendors, like my SaaS vendors, that I can actually communicate with to notify them of the fact. And what am I going to be asking them? Are you aware of it? Okay. Do you have a plan in place to patch it? Or if there's no patch available, what security control are you going to put in place to mitigate it? So I need an escalation problem. So I've got a cyber risk ratings tool, I've got a ticketing system, and the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to ask questionnaires or questions. Now, I get a lot of questions that head in my direction, and someone's picked up a framework and sent it in my direction, which is absolutely fine. Okay, it satisfies an auditor, and we put a whole pile of ticks in the box. Does it actually sit there and tell us or enable us to assess the risk? Probably not, because we're not asking the question supply chain compromise. And I've got some very good examples that we can, you know, take offline and speak about around this type of thing. But I find that a lot of questions are really irrelevant to assess the actual, you know, type of stuff. No one ever asks me, okay, do you have Office 365 and can you only access your Office 365 from corporate devices? I don't think I've ever seen that question. And that's huge, okay? A lot of people don't seem to realize how huge that is as a security issue.
So a few things you mentioned there, and I think a lot of people have this perception that the bad actors sit on the dark web and they operate from there. But what you're saying is open source tool ready available to anybody and everybody, and the bad actors are using them just as we use them to understand what our risks and our exposure is. Interesting.
Absolutely.
Okay, so talking about, we mentioned this earlier, how has the use of AI or machine learning impacted third-party supply chain risk management? I know there was a mention about AI, but how is AI coming into this and in helping us and enabling us to understand the risk?
So, if we look at it, okay, your threat actors are able to use AI to write scripts for them, do various things and help them out and speed up their process. But at the same time, what you're having to do on you as an organization evaluate your supply chain. You're asking people's questions. You're sitting there and looking at, open source intelligence. So what you want to be able to do is when people answer these questions, they tend to do it and they are quite generous with the answers that they provide. But people turn around and say, okay, what I've got is this series of questions I need answering, and I want to make this as painless as possible for everybody. Give me your policy documents, and I can now map policy documents to questionnaires using AI. Okay. It is possible to contain AI and make AI secure so that we are not, before everybody gets excited, revealing corporate data into the public domain and letting your AI learn from all of this exercise. So you can quite easily make AI do that. You can then say to your AI, okay, so now we've got all the questions answered. Do these actually relate to what we're physically seeing, and start showing me where the gaps happen to be? So that is a simplistic use of AI. It's available in a number of tools already to help you do that. You could also turn around to AI and say, okay, I've got a whole series of documents here or white papers around supply chain compromise over the last 3 years. Please list for me the 5 or 10 most common ways that supply chain compromise has taken place and the associated vendors. So instead of you having to go back and read all this information, suddenly AI will summarize that for you quite quickly and provide you with a lot of information. So there's a lot of use for AI to assist you in getting going on your supply chain journey here.
Okay, Nilesh, how important is continuous monitoring for third-party supply chain risk management, and what are the best ways to implement it?
So continuous monitoring is vital for identifying risks in real time and preventing incidents from escalating, right? Static assessments provide only a snapshot of what's going on, while the oversight reveal emerging threats. So implementing best practices, we've got to use threat intelligence platforms to monitor vendor vulnerabilities and breaches, deploying automatic tools to track changes in vendor risk profiles, integrating monitoring with governance risks, compliance tools to ensure seamless response, and regularly reviewing and updating risk thresholds to reflect change threat landscapes.
Thank you. Andrew, what regulatory frameworks or compliance standards should companies be most concerned with within the third-party supply chain risk management? And I know you mentioned a few, and Nilesh has mentioned a few, but maybe just go through the regulatory frameworks that an organization should adhere to regarding third-party supply chain risk management.
So probably the three that we're seeing the most in this regard would be NIS2, and these are European frameworks, but they'll filter down to various other parts of the world. So NIS2 is really around critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure is or anybody who's involved with critical infrastructure is being told they need to look at their supply chain. Now, we've seen various approaches from this, ranging from organizations that have decided that it might be a good idea to take this seriously, to organizations that are turning around and saying, what is the minimum that I need to do to put a tick in the box? Okay. Which is, it's sad to see that. Then there happens to be DORA. DORA has made an appearance, and we expect to see something similar, which is the European Digital Operational Resilience Act. That's all to do with financial institutions. And as we've seen with any financial type legislation, because if we take South African financial institutions, they have to trade internationally as well. So if they want to continue trading internationally, South Africa will be required to have similar legislation put in place, and financial institutions will need to start doing that. There is then a lot of organizations have ISO and want to go down the ISO 27001 type route, okay, which says look at your supply chain. But the literally the interpretation of this is very open, and it depends. You can actually achieve very good compliance with the actual frameworks quite easily and make it very, very effective without chewing through huge quantities of resource if you know what you're looking for.
And then, of course, I mean, every company now has it. They have some form of regulation around protection of personal identifiable information. So I presume they would also form part of this, be it GDPR, POPIA. I know Botswana have just introduced a Data Protection Act. That would also then form part of the regulatory and frameworks that you would have to adhere to, right?
It is, it's, although again, a lot of that's left to interpretation. So the easiest one to look at that is something like GDPR. Now, GDPR is an EU regulation, so it's meant to be enforced uniformly across the EU. And I have seen so many different implementations of that, from us complying with organizations and the agreements they want in place around simple things like name and email address, because that is PII data and you are processing PII data, and it has ranged from 100 pages of legal documentation to other organizations saying, well, it's a very low risk item. You only have a very few items, and it therefore doesn't warrant all the documentation that's meant to go with it, because there's just so little actually involved in it. So I haven't seen any uniform interpretation of that exercise, but best practice. It's about trust of your customer. So if they're giving you trust and giving you their data, why shouldn't you look after it?
Right. And you alluded to this now. How can companies prepare for increasing regulatory scrutiny around supply chain? And you mentioned Europe's now come with DORA. So how do companies take this on? How do they comply?
So, what I think was fascinating was we tried having conversations with companies during 2023 about NIS2. We tried having conversations with companies about NIS2 during the beginning of 2024. Surprisingly, okay, so NIS2, which is critical infrastructure, was not an EU regulation, okay, which means that it didn't apply uniformly. It meant that each individual country had to pass their own, laws surrounding it, because it was an EU directive. And, it was meant to all happen and be in place by mid-October. There were certain countries in the EU who still, when the actual deadline occurred, had not managed to get the legislation in place to do that, okay, which was quite shocking. And starting at the beginning of October, and this was taking place in October, the quantity of calls that we got about trying to get this in place and do something about it was just amazing, because everybody was leaving everything to absolutely the last minute. I find it sad that organizations, we have to have legislation to actually get this to happen. happen when there are, especially with supply chain, there are clear benefits to actually doing this and actually preventing it. It's a bit like driving with bald tires on your motor car, okay? Um, it's likely to lead to an accident or a blowout, but a lot of people will sit and take the risk because it's not likely to happen to them, okay? Their biggest concern actually is being pulled over by the police and receiving a fine, rather than anything else. So, it's better to sit here and do this, stop the actual it happening. I've seen organizations where it has happened to, and it's had a huge, huge impact on staff and morale and the actual organization as a whole, which is something that's not really spoken about. So, you know, avoid it happening in the first place.
Hmm. So that leads into the next question is, what proactive steps can organizations take to mitigate supply chain risk before they materialize? So what, as an organization, what do I need to do before I have an issue?
Sorry, but you're asking me about that.
Sorry, yeah, Andrew, I'm still sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm just leading on to the question,
Right.
yes. So what proactive steps can
Yeah.
organizations take to mitigate supply chain risk before they materialize?
So really it's about understanding your vendors. So it's a case of how, back to an area that we spoke about earlier, okay, is looking specifically at that vendor. And unfortunately, you can't just give this to procurement, okay? You need someone who really is going to understand it and apply some initiative to it. And a pattern will start emerging with your actual vendors, okay? And it's different from each organization depending on what you're actually doing. So, running through how can this vendor cause compromise to my organization? And I don't expect you to get this right immediately every single time. But if you stay on top of your subject, when you read about the subject and you say, I never thought about that. Okay, I asked that question about my supply chain because you've seen another compromise take place. It's like when the CrowdStrike issue hit, okay, that took a lot of businesses by surprise because it wasn't necessarily an actual compromise, okay, but it was a question that no one had entirely asked, okay, to start off with. So that was, in a way, something new. So that should now be noted down and say, well, is there a vendor out there that could cause this type of impact? Sure, there is a vendor like Octocode, Liquid. What happens if half of AWS falls over or something like that? So now what we do is, and what's written into a lot of this legislation in the EU is something called concentration risk. Okay, you have to understand concentration risk. So you take the vendor and say, well, how many or how much of my supply chain actually makes use of this vendor? And again, it's, it is limited to external and externally visible. But what is your actual threat actor doing? A lot of time, your threat actor is only working with externally visible information. Theoretically, yes, okay, I do agree that it can happen with internal stuff, but there's only so much we can do. And if we start with the external stuff and what's visible, that's a huge step in the right direction. So understanding concentration risk is of vital importance as well.
First time I've heard of concentration risk, but I understand the concept and the keenness, and the organization has to keep going, has to keep the lights on. They can't afford disruptions or interruptions, which CloudStrike definitely did, and it was just bad code. So yeah, it wasn't even a malicious attack. Nilesh, how can businesses strengthen relationships with third-party supply chain to foster shared responsibility for security. So here the onus is not just on me, but it's also my suppliers and vendors.
So any relationship is built on trust and collaboration. So in order to foster this, we've got to create shared goals. So aligning security expectations in contracts, again, emphasizing mutual accountability, engaging regularly, collaboration efforts, collaboration teams, conducting joint risk assessments, sharing threat intelligence, and maintaining open communication channels is key, and providing support to each other. So, I mean, collaboration comes with support as well, right? So, offering training programs and resources to help third parties enhance cybersecurity posture and rewarding compliance. So, it's not always it's always a do, but we've got to start rewarding when things go right. So, rewarding compliance, recognizing and incentivizing vendors who demonstrate a proactive commitment to security standards. Also, we'll start pushing some of the other third parties we work with to provide better service, to provide security, give us that shared responsibility.
Yeah, that collaboration is key because we know the bad actors all collaborate amongst themselves. And we live in a very competitive environment, and everybody is very much after their sort of share of the pie. But as if we start collaborating, I think we're better off. I like that idea
Yeah,
about
look, I mean,
collaboration, trust.
if you think about it, in this industry, we're all working to strive for the same goal. As much as we might be different businesses doing different things, we're all working to strive for the same goal. And if we don't start collaborating across each other, start learning from each other, start talking more, we're never going to get this right. So the idea is we've got to start talking, start having more of these conversations, start putting our minds together. Active learning from each other is the only way to start creating those stronger relationships, and building out the security posture.
Andrew, this question is for you because I know we've discussed this and before, and we've been in presentations around this. What role does financial risk quantification play in supply chain risk management, and how can it be effectively applied?
So financial risk quantification is a very useful tool, definitely upfront when you are comparing two vendors that you might be wanting to share data with. So you're trying to do a risk assessment. So vendor A has given you a price of, let's say $100,000 for the CRM solution they're going to provide you. You're going to put a lot of data in there. Vendor B has given you a price of $110,000. But what you're now required to do, because of regulatory framework, business requirements, you're required to do a risk assessment. So the question now is, how do you fairly and objectively assess the risk and report back to business as to the risk associated with each of those vendors? So if I go back and I say to business, well, they're both a B, business is going to go back and say, what? And you say, okay, well, it's 85%. Okay. And business is like, I'm still confused. Okay. So you say, well, it's 650. Okay. That's their risk score. Business is going to say, we paid you all that money for this program that you told us we had to have, okay, and you're giving us percentages and letters and risk numbers, okay, it means absolutely nothing to us and helps us nothing in our decision process, okay. If I turn around and I use something called the FAIR model, which is from the FAIR Institute, which enables you to normalize a company and take the quantity of data, the location, and the risk associated with that company and apply a monetary amount to it, okay? And what do you do with a risk? So the risk that it's calculating is the risk in financial terms associated with the vendor should they have a data breach with your data under your regulatory framework, because it's you who's going to get fined by your actual regulator. And in which case it comes back and it says, oh, okay, vendor A is going to sit here and they're going to end up, and they have $50,000 worth of risk. So what I do with risk, so easiest way to make the risk go away is I'm going to insure against it. So if I hypothetically insure against that at 10%, then the risk associated or mitigation of that risk is going to cost me $5,000. Okay, so I go along and I apply that to vendor A. They're now at $105,000. Okay, but vendor B literally has minimal associated with them, and they're sitting there. Okay, and I really don't need to go out and insure against them because they've got the act together and their house in order and everything. So now it's a case of, well, 100 plus 5, and the other one was at 110. Okay, well, there's a $5,000 saving here. I'm able to go back and provide the business with meaningful information that they understand, and it has been objectively calculated. So using something like a financial risk quantification model for vendors, and you can extend it, okay, if you want, to ransomware and also business continuity, and look at those factors as well if you want to create a more three-dimensional model as to the risk that those organizations bring to the party.
Thank you. Nilesh, this one's for you. How do you stay current with the constantly evolving landscape of third-party supply chain cyber threats?
So staying informed requires proactive and multifactored research, right? So subscribing to threat intelligence feeds. There's so many around, but with some of the key ones are InfraGard, FS, ISAC, are some key ones to look into. Join industry-specific forums to exchange knowledge, best practices, attend some of these webinars, attend the roundtable discussions, attending conferences to learn about emerging trends and solutions, regularly reviewing updates from the regulatory bodies to ensure compliance with new guidelines. Sometimes not only for the specific country you're living in, but across the globe. Participate in training and certification programs to deepen your understanding of evolving threat landscapes is also key. And having active discussions with counterparts in the industry. We have a lot of these forums, we have a lot of these collaboration sessions, these discussions. Have active conversations, ask active questions. If you don't ask about some of the aspects you don't know, how do we ever learn? It's also different thinking, different thought processes. So sometimes it's great to sit down, have a discussion, maybe issues that you're dealing with in your organization. There's unique ways of determining solutions around it.
So that leads in, and I think we've discussed this already. What role do industry collaborations play in strengthening supply chain security? So maybe you just want to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, so industry collaborations are crucial for pooling resources and knowledge to combat systematic risks. So information sharing. Collaborations enable faster detection and response by exchanging intelligence on threats and vulnerabilities. Best practices, which help develop standards and guidelines, ensuring consistency across the supply chain. Collective actions. So collaborative efforts such as joint exercises and audits fosters a unified defense against widespread attacks. Some of these examples include sector-specific information sharing and analysis centers and public-private partnerships.
Thank you. Andrew, how should organizations approach third-party risk differently in the post-COVID-19 business landscape?
So if we have a look at COVID and what COVID caused to happen with the organizations, everybody got up in the morning, went into the office, and they had access to a lot of infrastructure that was available in the office. pre-COVID as well, a lot of network traffic was unencrypted, and the use of SaaS platforms wasn't as great. If we move post-COVID, what has happened? Everybody's now working from home. Okay, all your traffic on things like your network is encrypted because everybody's using SaaS applications, so it's now all HTTPS. So having taken all of that into account, let's use a simple practical example, and you mentioned it earlier with things like PII data, okay? You sit there and you turn around and say, well, my data needs to remain in the country, okay, or it must remain within the EU or whichever boundary you'd like to put it in. What that actually means is that means it must be reside and viewed only in that jurisdiction. So now you happen to have this more global workforce that happens to be out there, and they're accessing people's data, and they happen to have machines that sit at home. What need to be assessed, and a lot of the frameworks haven't caught up with this yet when you're asking these questions, is a couple of things. Where is my data going to be accessed from? Can you guarantee that it will be only accessed from within a set jurisdiction? And the next is back to my good old question around things like Outlook and various other items. Is that only going to be accessed from a corporate device? Okay, reason being is corporate device is likely to be a lot more secure than a home device. So a home device is whatever anybody's built. It's probably a multi or a shared device. Anybody's got access to it, and your threat actor relies on that to be able to start compromising. So really, what's changed is what you should be doing differently is thinking how things have evolved since COVID. We've also seen massive rise of supply chain compromise since COVID. So really, this is something that has evolved dramatically. If we look at it, the first instance of this was really 2020 SolarWinds when we saw that, okay, and the world has changed entirely. Since then, we've got two areas of conflict going on as well. So all of that has added to it. We've got nation state players digging up 0 days and releasing them. Literally, it's it's a completely different playing field to what we started with post-COVID. Literally, there's very little comparison you could do to before and after.
Staying with you, Andrea, and I think in the same theme here, are there emerging risks in supply chain security that you think organizations may be overlooking?
Overlooking most of them. They're honestly overlooking most of them because they are a lot of what is going on and a lot of the advice out there and a lot of when you just read the regulation, it's you do a risk assessment of your supply chain or your vendor. So someone goes and does a risk assessment of the vendor. Let's take Citrix as a good example. If I sit here and I risk assess Citrix as a company, it tells me nothing about Citrix as a product. But I'm not using Citrix as a company. I'm not sharing my data with Citrix. I'm using the Citrix product. So now I go and do this whole risk assessment on Citrix, and it comes up smelling of roses. And 2 weeks later, I end up with a supply chain compromise from Citrix. And the board's going to come to me and say, but you paid so-and-so a lot of money to do this risk assessment of this vendor for us. 2, 3 weeks later, this specific vendor where we did all of this risk assessment has caused this compromise in our organization. You're going to go and look at your tooling like your vulnerability management tools and various others, and it's like, so why was I not able to see this? Where did I actually go wrong? Why did I end up being targeted? And even after this, okay, there's still this nagging doubt that the question hasn't necessarily been answered. And we're seeing this time and time again where it is happening. It's happening to big reputable organizations because it's sitting in a blind spot and there isn't the awareness out there as to what to look and how to look. And that is why your threat act is being so successful with it.
Key point there, blind spot, bad actors. You got a blind spot, the bad actor's going to take advantage of it. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So the
Absolutely.
last question is for Nilesh. What are your thoughts on the role of environmental, social, and governance factors in third-party risk and supply chain risk management?
Environmental, social, and governance factors are increasingly critical. As stakeholders demand responsibility practices incorporating ESG into these risk management, we need to start aligning values. So promoting ethical and sustainable operations across the supply chain is key, reducing risks, mitigating reputational and legal exposure by ensuring compliance with labor, environmental, and governance standards, and encouraging innovation. Drive vendors to adopt cleaner technologies and improve operational efficiency. Businesses need to integrate these factors and these criteria into vendor assessments, contracts, and ongoing evaluations.
Thanks. We've got 5 minutes left. I'm just going to go around the table. So, Nilesh, starting with you, anything that you would like to add regarding supply chain risk, third-party risk?
Look, I think in a nutshell, we've spoken about a lot in the last hour, right? And I think we've stressed a lot of the factors of, third-party risk has to start from the bottom up. So everything from the time you engage with the supplier, from the time contracts are driven, all the way up to that consistent regurgitation, the reassessment of the vendor. We need to be active in the way we do this, creating the right frameworks, creating the right processes and policies to review third-party vendors, because the environments change, the organizations change, things are ongoing all the time, and if we don't change the way we look at third-party risk today and the way we actually respond to third-party risk today, we're always going to be caught in this in this consistent cycle.
Andrew, any last words?
Yeah, I'd like to answer a question from Tammy that's she's
Okay.
put in the chat, and that is, what are some key indicators that a third party might pose a higher risk to an organization? So I'm going to take one that's, it gets asked a lot, okay? Let's go down the phishing route, okay? So the question you need to ask is my, and if it answers some of the next question about creating a third-party risk awareness culture across all departments, not just IT. Okay, so let's take an ideal vendor, payroll. So you've outsourced payroll. We're seeing this more and more, okay? So everybody's well aware of who pays their actual salary. They get a pay slip from a vendor. So in which case, receiving an email or being phished by that vendor or getting an email from that vendor, you're probably going to trust them. They send you your pay slip every month. So when they sit there and say, please, will you sit here and click on this? I need you to confirm your bank details, okay, so that you receive your salary this month, you're probably going to do that, okay? So let's go and look at what you should be doing on a key risk indicator for supply chain. Have you verified that that vendor has an SPF, a DKIM record, and DMARC properly implemented, okay, so that your threat actor cannot sit there and, use their domains to be able to actually send specific addresses, and have you as an organization implemented, okay, the checking of DMARC so that you will only receive emails from that. So those are just some simple type things that need to be happening. If it's a generic vendor, okay, would I worry about this from Microsoft? No, because it doesn't matter whether Microsoft has that, doesn't have it, okay, people are going to fish you and pretend to be Microsoft. But it's the more obvious ones in your supply chain, okay, that you need to be looking at. And I'm not saying that it's going to be a complete prevention, but those are the type of things that you need to be doing.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for the time. We're almost out of time.
Okay.
So for some of the key points I've taken out of this was supply chain risk management, third-party risk intelligence, whatever you want to call it, is key to an organization. As Andrew alluded to, there are blind spots. And I think, in the conversation we've had, we've realized and recognized that supply chain risk management for a lot of organizations is a blind spot. Also, the tools that you might have in place can only take you so far. So to the panel, thank you very much for your time. To all the people out there, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Richard and Lish.